We are in Genesis, the 24th chapter. And in this chapter, we have a lot of interesting things take place, and we see the narrative of God's story. As we mentioned this morning and last Sunday morning, about God creating a kingdom, right? He creates this beautiful world, this beautiful earth, and he puts man to rule over it. But we wanted to roll our own way, and we created our own kingdom. And it's amazing to me that in this earthly kingdom, even what seems to be beautiful really has a difficult edge to it, or a harsh reality to it, doesn't it? One of the examples I think of the last, really for about the last week, I've been hearing songbirds in the morning. And boy, they are a beautiful thing to hear, aren't they? It means that spring is coming, and all that snow is in the process of being washed away this week, and spring is nearly upon us. But while I enjoy going out and listening to those beautiful snowbirds, the harsh reality is that they're not singing for my pleasure, Emily. You see, as they migrate north every spring, the reason they're singing so loud is it's actually a battle cry. They're getting into their territory and they're crying out, "You stay away from me, this is my territory." And there is so much in nature that's exactly like that. It's so beautiful from a little bit of a distance. But boy, those little songbirds get vicious when another songbird comes into their territory. And just the same way, so much in our life that looks beautiful from a distance has some harsh realities to them. So being that we've corrupted this kingdom, that we've fallen from the grace, the preciousness of God's kingdom, He's been working diligently now throughout our narrative to restore that kingdom. And He made that promise to Abraham, that through Abraham, all nations would once again be blessed. And we enter a new generation here tonight in Genesis, the 24th chapter. As we'll note in a moment, Sarah dies in the 23rd chapter, and Abraham dies in the 25th chapter. We are making preparations for that next generation tonight. So in chapter 23, as I just mentioned, we see the death of Sarah. Sarah lives to be 127 years old, which means that Isaac is 37 years old. Excuse me, did I say 127? Okay, that's what I meant to say. 127 years old Sarah lives, which means that Isaac is 37 when she passes away. Abraham, in this 23rd chapter then, goes about to secure a burial land. We see just how much of a pilgrim Abraham is in this chapter. In fact, he goes to the Hittites and he says, "Allow me to buy a burial plot. Allow me to buy a place for a tomb to bury my wife, because I'm not from this country." And I think here in this 23rd chapter, we get a strong reminder of just what God is required of him. To leave his home, to leave his people, to leave his land, and all of those things that are connected to it behind. But I also see that Abraham, who's a strong and mighty person, remember, who went out and defeated the kings when Lot was kidnapped, treats the Hittites with respect and pays them more than sufficiently for the land that he is buying. I believe in this, a principle from God, that unlike the kingdom of this world, power is not the currency to be used by God's people. So Abraham buys this burial land, and there Sarah is buried. And then as we come into the 24th chapter, in just a few moments we'll be looking at that, we see that he turns his attention to the next generation, and he sends a servant to pick a wife for Isaac. Mike, is that how you and Brenda found wives for your sons? Send a servant out to... No, that's not how I found Amanda neither. And we'll talk about some of the differences in the ceremony. There's some interesting, culturally significant points in this chapter, and some really interesting points about some of these ceremonies and traditions. But I want to plant a seed at this point before we start into the text about the 24th chapter. As I was studying throughout it this week a couple of times, it really occurred to me what a foreshadowing this chapter is of Jesus and his church. You'll remember that just the chapter prior, in chapter 22, that Abraham is sacrificing, or nearly sacrificing, Isaac. And the significance of that scripturally is the sacrifice that Jesus is going to make, the fact that God is going to sacrifice his only begotten Son, and that Jesus is going to be that willing sacrifice for you and I. And just as that ram was stuck in the thickets and provided by God, he will provide the sacrifice for you and I. Well, I certainly would not make this a doctrinal point because I don't think there's enough biblical support for it. But it occurred to me the parallel of this chapter of Jesus going to a far country to acquire his bride. And when in this 24th chapter the bride is found, when Rebekah is found, one of the questions we're going to see debated early in this chapter is, when I find a bride, a prospective bride, will she be willing to follow back to my land? I think that's a good question for you and I to deal with on a daily basis. Jesus has come a long ways to acquire his bride. Will I follow him home? I believe that's a good individual question. It's a good collective question as a congregation of Christ's body. Am I willing to follow Christ, to be his, no matter what the cost? The golden text that we're going to look at tonight, as we read it, if you turn to the 25th chapter, and we're going to read 8 and 9 here for just a moment, may be a little bit puzzling. We're going to come back to it at the end of our lesson and hopefully bring this home. In verses 8 and 9 of the 28th chapter, we read, Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Verse 9 is something amazing to me that I really hadn't thought too much about until last Wednesday. I was at Roseville for their Sunday or Wednesday afternoon Bible study, and John brought out verse 9. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah. I actually practiced that name several times, but you couldn't tell now, could you? Machpelah, there we go, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar, the Hittite, east of Mamre. Now, I could just stopped way before I read those names. Because did you catch who buried Abraham? Isaac and Ishmael. Now, I believe there's likely two scenarios that are possible here. Either Abraham continued to have a relationship with Ishmael, which I hope is the case. Or Ishmael comes back after his father's death. At any rate, it is the case we know that burying loved ones oftentimes brings people back together. And we see an example of this in this 25th chapter. Plant that seed, but if you would, come back to the 24th chapter, and like I said, we'll finish and conclude there with that point in just a few minutes or a couple hours, whichever the case is. In verses 1 through 4, we see the preparation for the next generation made by Abraham. Genesis 24, starting in verse 1. Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac. Now, we see here that Abraham is advanced in age. He's looking at the end, if you will. And he asks his servant, he says, I want you to make a promise. I want you to make an oath with me that you will not find a wife from the people of Canaan for Isaac, but rather will go to our homeland and find a wife. Now, maybe that explains, and I know, did Ella go out to the bathroom? Kendi, his dad talked to you about how old you need to be before you date?
His dad let you have a boyfriend. How old do you have to be? How old is daddy say you have to be to have a boyfriend? I think you said you're never allowed to have one.
Never allowed to have one. Allie, how old do you have to be?
He doesn't like boys right now, so we're safe.
Perfect. Perfect. Isaac is 40 years old when he's married. He's 37 when Sarah dies. 40 years old. So I think that's an appropriate age frame, Kennedy. Okay, 40 years old. She's going to ignore me. Pretend he's not there. Maybe he'll go away. 40 years old. But I think this is maybe a reason why. We are in Canaan. And again, I said earlier in the 23rd chapter, we see what Abraham gave up. Their next point to look ahead is God will provide a way. But that does not mean it's easy. You know, a lot of times we say, well, if God willing, if He wills it, it's going to take place. And what that oftentimes means is I'm going to sit on my hands, and if it happens, it was God's will. I understand the premise, and last time I said this, I caught a lot of flack over it. But the song, Jesus Take the Wheel, is not one of my favorite songs. Because, I picture this young lady driving, letting go of the wheel and screaming, Jesus, take the wheel. And, sometimes I think that's how we want to go through life. God, take this. And there's an aspect where we have to trust God. But the point is that God is not making the way easy for Abraham. He's not smoothing all the potholes. He doesn't even have a place to bury his wife. He doesn't have a home. He's living out of a tent. And he doesn't have the surroundings of the appropriate peers for his son to have a wife. Abraham is sacrificed, and while God prepares a way, it took a lot of effort and a lot of trials on his behalf. But he makes his servant take an oath, and the significance of that oath, or the culture surrounding that oath is very strange to us. He says, put your hand under my thigh, and there's maybe a few different ideas, probably quite a few ideas of what that is, but I think we're getting at two things. Obviously, the oath that we're taking is concerning reproduction. It's concerning the next generation. And secondly, the circumcision is the sign of God's promise and covenant at this point. So as in the court of law, oftentimes we'll lay our hands on the Bible, right, as the source of the covenant to take an oath or to affirm something. I think Abraham's asking his servant to do something along the same lines. And so he says, make this oath that you'll not pick a wife from amongst these people, but that you'll go back to my homeland. And I think there's great significance in this. And young folks, I bring this up quite often, but I don't think often enough. Maybe we need to talk about it more. And even in a couple of our Zoom meetings, I've tried to make you as uncomfortable as I possibly can. But who you marry is a very important concept. And Paul's not just simply talking about marriage, married adults. He's talking about other concepts like business relationships when he says, be not unevenly yoked. He's talking about these intimate, these close relationships that are going to affect us for the rest of our lives. And again, I mentioned earlier that some of the cultural aspects of taking an oath seem very foreign to us, and they are in some of the terminology that Paul uses when he talks about not being unevenly yoked is foreign to us. But this is a good illustration of what it means to be unevenly yoked. I referred to, or at least alluded to earlier, the fact that the realities of this life can tend to be quite harsh. The burdens that we are forced to carry in this life are heavy. This oxen on the left, as you look at the slide, has got his work cut out for him, doesn't he? In fact, he's not going to accomplish much. Some of the pictures I found while Googling this had a donkey and an oxen yoked together. Abraham understands if Isaac's going to be successful that he needs a bride that's going to help him. He needs a bride that's going to build his life up and his household up. And young folks, you need spouses. You need friends. When the time is appropriate, Naomi, you need a boyfriend who will help you build up, not tear down. And so Abraham's willing to send his servant a long ways. I thought it was quite the accomplishment when Amanda went to Penn State. She went to main campus all 4 years. That's an hour and a half one way to drive. Abraham's servant is traveling days upon days. I was in Grandma's Corsica at the time. He's likely he is on camels. With no air conditioning, I promise. The point being that it costs something to find the right person. One of the things it costs is passing on all the wrong people. I found in business that one of the principles of getting a good deal is not taking a bad deal. Because once you take the bad deal, all the rest of them are off the table. So young folks, it's important who you choose to hang out with, who you choose to spend time with, who you choose to allow to influence in your life. Today, we're talking about marriage. Adults, are the principles any different for us? We may have chosen our spouse, but we choose who we spend time with. We choose who we allow to have influence on our life. We choose whom we want to become more like each and every day. And so Abraham says, you go back to my country, into my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac. Now, in verses 5 through 9, I believe that we see what I referred to a few moments ago. The Lord will provide a way. The servant said to him, verse 5, perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? I'll pause there after verse 5. For some of us, finding a wife was a harder sell than others, Brenda. I had to work hard at it. And the servant here is saying, how do you expect me to find a woman who's willing to follow me the whole way back here, not for a blind date, Emily, for a blind marriage? How do you think that's going to happen? I just barely got the job sold as is. I think if I had to overcome all those obstacles, I'd have been out of luck. And so, verse 6, Abraham says to his servant, see to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, and who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I will give you this land. He will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then free from the oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham, his master, and swore to him concerning this matter. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that Abraham is sending a servant. Now, we say Abraham's advanced in age, and that's why he's not going himself. A Christian, I believe, that is with us online, and I want to assure a Christian that I would not send an employee, I would go myself for this task. But Abraham's of significant age, and so we might be tempted, or we might think that that's why Abraham doesn't come back. But in the dialogue, we see even a more important principle come up, and that is the servant says to Abraham, if she won't bring me back, what am I to do? Am I to get Isaac and take him there to meet her? Maybe that it'll be a little easier sell then, I see the servant saying. And Abraham says, in Mike's words, don't you dare take my son back there. And he reiterates it in this short passage and says it 2 different times. In other words, in this, I think we see that Abraham is not going back just simply because he's too old. Abraham is not going back with purpose. Abraham's been away from there since he was 75 years old, and he has no intentions of going back, nor is he sending his son back there. Why? Hebrews, the 11th chapter, in verses 15 and 16, speaking of Abraham and the other forefathers, said that if they had thought or wanted to return to the country from whence they came, they would have had opportunity to do so. You see, in following God's will, Abraham had turned his back on a lot of things. And for you and I think there's a strong reminder that we ought not turn back to the things that we've put behind us. Lot's wife from a few chapters ago, is a good example of this, who, fleeing Sodom, looks back and suffers the consequences of it. Young folks, once again, I will tell you that you are getting to set the pattern for the rest of your life. I know that many of you don't think that the decisions you get to make right here and now are significant, but they are. You are setting a direction. At your point of life, you have tremendous potential ahead of you, but there's also tremendous risk ahead of you. The things that you will involve yourself in will either strengthen you, will make your future better and easier, or they will entangle you and be a weight and snare for the rest of your life. Abraham says, "Do not dare take my son back there." As a parent, I see a good reminder here of what I involve my children in. I teach my children about finances. I try and teach my children principles about business. I try and make sure that they are learning the basic principles in school so that they can use them as they go throughout their lives. All three of my children are in sports. All three of my children have hobbies. I want to make sure that they know what our priorities are. That comes first and foremost by example. That comes first and foremost by seeing it displayed in my life. And it is played out as I make decisions for them. The Lord will provide a way. It's not necessarily the easy way. It's interesting to me that servant says, "What if she won't come back?" And Abraham says, "The Lord that's had my back, the Lord that's had my past, will have our future. He will send an angel ahead, and he will prepare the way." This verse in particular made me think of Jesus and his bride, because wasn't it John the Baptist that prepared the way for him? That servant still had to mount those camels, still had to go the whole way out there, still spent a great deal of time praying and a lot of effort. The Lord will provide a way. Now, there's a lot of dialogue, and it adds a lot of richness to this story in verses, the in-between verses, verses 10 through 59. But for time's sake, we're going to move to verses 60 and following. And what's happened in the intern is that the servant back to Abraham's people, to Abraham's country, and he says to God, he prays to God, and he says, "God, how will I know who the right woman is?" He says, "I am going to wait here at a well." And at that time, usually the women would carry pots out to the well. I once saw a report concerning Honduras that said, on average, a family in Honduras spends 7 hours a day getting clean water. We walk to the spigot and go, shh. Very lucky. And sometimes, Corey, that's too much of a burden. I'll say, hey, Red. Hey, Evie. Right? But they spend 7 hours a day getting clean water. And so the servant says, "Lord, as I'm here praying, I'm going to ask of a woman that comes to this well, can you give me a drink?" And the one that says, "Yes, and let me draw out water for your camels too," she's the one. Boy, there's a lot of talk about right spouses, and youngsters, I talked to you a few moments ago, but there is the answer. when she or he's willing to draw out water for the camels too, you've got something. Dad, I didn't realize it at the time, but a lot of Amanda and I's dates started at your place as I was finishing up working. She'd show up, and I was never done taking care of the horses. And I'd say, hey, clean those couple stalls or water those horses, and then we'll get going on our date. Well, I was doing the same. So I didn't realize that what I was doing was a biblical concept, but I found out in my studies it is. And so while he's yet praying, Rebekah comes up to him, and he says, can I have a drink of water? And she does exactly as he had prayed. She says, yes, and let me draw water for your camels as well. And so he goes back to their house, and he tells the family what he is after, and that he wants Rebekah's hand in marriage for Abraham's son, Isaac. And they say, well, that's good, but we agree to it, but give her some time. Give us some time together. He says, no, I really have to get going. I've got to get back. And so they said, we'll leave it up to Rebekah. And Rebekah leaves on the following day. Can you imagine that? You're just going out to get some water for the family. You meet a guy, and the next day you're leaving. That's love before first sight, isn't it, Brenda? Well before first sight. And so we'll talk about that after we read these couple verses. Verse 60, and they blessed Rebekah, speaking of her family, and said to her, our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him. Then Rebekah and her young women arose and rode on the camels and followed the man. Thus the servant took Rebekah and went his way. Now Isaac had returned from Beersheba, and was dwelling in Negeb. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field towards evening, and he lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, there were camels coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel and said to the servant, who is that man walking in the field to meet us? The servant said to her, it is my master. So she took her veil and covered herself. And the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her, here's the ceremony. What's the average? $27,000 that people spend on weddings nowadays? Someone's going to Google that. If I'm too far off, speak up. But last I looked at, those were numbers in the ballpark. This is a cheap wedding ceremony, isn't it? Verse 67, then Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted from his mother's death. How much? $30,000. It was a few years ago. $30,000 on average. I was behind on my stats. I've been asked, what does it take to be married? Legally, it takes just a little bit more than that, but that's what it takes, right? Amanda and I were married outside, and I had people say, does that even count? You weren't even in a church. Well, neither was Isaac, right? There's more to marriage than a wedding, isn't there? And there's more to love than emotion. I believe the answer to how can Rebekah drop her family and go like she did, and how can they have never met each other and have a marriage like this are one and the same. You see, I think her family really touched on it in verse 60. Our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him. You see, their eyes were on bigger things. You see, Isaac understood his heritage, and Rebekah understood what she wanted her heritage to be. There's time, spouses. Your spouse is going to want to choke you. You're going to want to choke your spouse. You're going to disagree on a lot of things. but let us forever be united on the heritage that God has set before us. I believe it is the most important aspect in our lives. And so I close once again with 25 and verse 9, where we see Isaac and Ishmael come back, and we see them united at the death of Abraham. I'd leave this caution: if you have things in your life that you need to make different, don't wait. If you have people in your life that you need to make up with, and you need to make something right, don't wait. And ultimately, as the death of Abraham united Isaac and Ishmael, is it not the case that the death of Jesus Christ should unite you and I? If you have need, a prayer, need of encouragement, or any other spiritual need, if you're here and present physically, I encourage you to come forth and make that known. If you're with us online, I encourage you to reach out and allow us to do what we can to help you.